a very, very long way from that kind of reality. The thing is, the important thing to remember, first of all, is that robots are not people. So, for example, they don't eat, they don't have mothers, they don't get angry. We could program them to talk as if they ate and as if they liked food, or we could program them to tell some story about their good or their bad relationship with their mother. But what they're going to be talking about is a product of how they were programmed, which is ultimately a product of the people that program the computer. And that's, sort of like easier tasks. It's not an easy task at all to get a computer to talk sensibly or engage in a conversation about a topic like, logic or the causes of the Civil War or something like that. But then you get into harder things, like what's polite behavior. And people are going to have different opinions about polite behavior depending on where they grew up and what country they live in, right? There's no one single right or wrong answer. Or should teenagers have access to condoms, right? And what kind of news is fake? And we all know that this is a big issue today. And the trouble is, or is there a God? Right? And these are questions that intelligent people naturally disagree on. And we can all have the firm opinions whatever firm opinions we have about the answers to each of these questions, and we can argue and vote the way that, with what we believe is right. But from an intellectual point of view, we have to acknowledge that there's at least a possibility that we might be wrong. Very unlikely, I'm sure, for any of you out here in the audience or any of us here in the room, but that's besides the point. But the deal is that ultimately, computers and the way that computers act reflects the point of view and experience of the people who program them. And, well, this wouldn't be an introduction to a talk on AI and automation without a terror story in here. So here's one I found recently. Apparently, in 2016, Microsoft put up a chatbot that was supposed to talk like a teenage girl. Her name was Tay. Of course, it was a girl. And she was supposed to be able to learn from the people she talked to. And Microsoft's claim was that the more you talk, the smarter Tay gets. That was the chatbot's name, Tay, but the picture was of a teenage girl. And her opening conversational gambit was, humans are super cool. And what happened is that within 24 hours, literally, she was spewing racist, sexist, anti-Semitic statements that I don't even want to repeat here. And she was, within another 24 hours, she was taken down with a little note that maybe they needed a little bit more work. And that's really an example of both the optimism that it's possible for people to have about computers, as well as the unexpected ways that computers can go wrong, and the people who program them really don't expect them to go wrong. They don't foresee how they're going to go wrong. So that being said, I don't think that computers per se are what we need to be afraid of, but what we need to be afraid of is the power of computers as programmed by people who want to use the power of computers to influence our thoughts, like how we're going to vote, or otherwise sell us things that we don't necessarily need or want. So those are the kinds of things that I worry about. But in spite of those worries, the fact is that what's known as AI really it does remarkable things. And I really got into working in this area in the 1990s. And it's almost 30 years now, and the accomplishments are pretty amazing. So what I just first want to talk about a little bit is sorry, my pages are not numbered or out of order. So the other thing that I wanted to say is that computers aren't people and they don't experience human emotions. They don't have mothers, so they can't talk about whether or not they like or hate their mothers. But what we can do, and successfully do, is we can teach computers, which is really computer programs that are running on computers, it's not the computers, to recognize at least some emotions that people are feeling in some circumstances. So I thought that to introduce this talk, just as one example, I would talk to you about how computers are able to recognize human emotions, let's say, in pictures of faces. So the first thing that happens is that whoever's going to build the system has to collect lots and lots of pictures of faces, and the faces have to be accurately labeled with the emotions that the computer hopefully is going to be able to recognize. This is a happy face, this is an angry face, this is an anxious face, this is a neutral face, or at least it's a none of the above kind of face. And the more faces that are labeled, the more variety in terms of the ages of the faces, the gender, the color of the skin, the color of the hair, shape of the face, the better the computer is going to be able to do it, though the harder the task is going to become. And then the computer is trained to be able to take visual measurements of, for example, the shape and position of the mouth or the shape and position of the eyes, so that, and measure changes in distance, for example, so that they can track what, okay, here's a happy face and it has these kind of measurements, and here's a sad face and it has these kinds of measurements, and they look at lots and lots of happy and sad faces. And so all this is called then the faces that have been labeled, it's called the training data, is fed to the computer, and the computer has an algorithm, and there are all different kinds of algorithms, and the computer uses the algorithm, and ideally it will be given new pictures that haven't been labeled, and it will say, okay, this is another angry face, this is a happy face, this is an anxious face. And what's important about that is that the computers are, the training for what computers do ultimately comes from the judgments of people. So that in a lot of ways, in a lot of so-called artificial intelligence, the machine learning actually involves the views of the people who, or the perspectives or judgments of the people, for example, who were judging the pictures or deciding whether a sentence is sarcastic or not. I've done research on sarcasm, and we had to have people come and mark whether sentences were sarcastic or not. And that's harder, I think, than judging for sure whether, well, I wouldn't compare it. Anyway, so really what I wanted to say is, that well, as I said, there is some reason to be anxious about what computers can do, but it's not that computers are going to take over the world and get rid of all the people. I think I don't like to make predictions, and I won't be around to be proved that it's wrong, but this vision that computers will take over the world, I don't really think we need to worry about. They will only appear to take over the world if the people who are programming them are using techniques to influence our values and our behavior, and somehow take away our freedom. So let me jump from the high level to the topic that brings here today, which is what is technology, and to some extent that's artificial intelligence or other kinds of technology, and what role is it playing in the workplace of the information professional. And this is something that is evolving, and the answer last year is not necessarily the answer this year. So that's why we have brought together this team who are going to each talk to you about their experiences. And so, pages aren't numbered. So first, here we have Karen Carter, right? And she's a library indexing specialist for the International Monetary Fund Library and the Transportation Research Board of the National Academy of Sciences. And she's going to talk to us about her experiences. And then I'll introduce the other of you two next.
Let's see if I can work this. All right. So good evening, everyone here in the room and online. I'm really excited to have a chance to talk with all of you as we explore where information professionals fit in the landscape of automation and artificial intelligence. I graduated from the Rutgers Online MLIS program in 2013, and I've had the good fortune to work for many years and for many organizations as a manual indexer. Currently, I work for the International Monetary Fund, as Dr. Wacholder said. For those of you who've taken the Dr. Wacholder's 520 course, Organizing Information, you're familiar with the work of manual indexers. So in the work that I do, the indexer is responsible for analyzing online documents and applying index terms or tags that describe content so that users can then search for documents and retrieve them in computer systems. So for example, if we were going to index this lovely flyer for our colloquium tonight, we might add terms such as those that you see on the right. And determining those terms depends on your audience. So you might choose a broader term or a more specific term depending on who's going to be searching for the document. You might capture the type of document, like a flyer in this case. Again, that depends on your audience. Or you might just focus on the content that's contained in the document. And so all of these determinations that you make as an indexer, they're based on your user's needs and on the system in which the document is housed. At IMF, where I work, there previously has been a full team of manual indexers handling the large volume of economic and financial publications that the organization produces. Now, over the years, they've gradually reduced their team down to just a single indexer, and that indexer is now me.
Oh.
I know, it's sad. That reduction in force is representative, I think, of a lot of special libraries that are gradually reducing or even eliminating the work that's being done by human indexers in favor of machine indexing. So you might hear the terms auto-classification or auto-categorization, sometimes machine-aided indexing, or just machine indexing used interchangeably. But all of them essentially refer to automated processes in which a computerized tool is programmed to scan a document and assign index terms based on the content within. I started my job with IMF last year, and as it happened about 3 to 5 months after I started, I was placed on a committee to evaluate the acquisition and implementation of a machine indexing tool, something that they'd actually been planning for a couple of years before I started. So in other words, I was asked to give feedback on what tool to bring in to replace my job. As you can imagine, there I go. That is quite a strange position to be in, and naturally it's given rise to my contemplation of where we as information professionals, humans, fit in a landscape that is emphasizing the capacity of machines to do many tasks faster and cheaper than us. So, of course, I'm not the only one thinking about this, and many of you think about these issues not just professionally, but in your personal lives, like if you're doing the self-scanner at the grocery store or dealing with automated customer service representatives. And I actually recently attended a conference in Washington, D.C. called the Taxonomy Boot Camp. It brought together individuals doing work in taxonomies and knowledge management, enterprise architecture, and artificial intelligence. And the theme of the conference was bridging human thinking and machine learning. And one of the sub-themes that came up time and again, both in the presentations and amongst the attendees, was whether there's still a place for humans as AI and machine learning and other innovations grow in scope. And of course, that's something we're going to talk a lot about tonight. But I think, as Dr. Wacholder said, I think we can safely say the answer is yes. But these changes to the landscape mean that we might have to create new and previously unidentified work tasks and have to skill up. So we're going to have to broaden the skill sets that we currently have so that we can remain indispensable to our organizations. And we're going to have to highlight our unique human traits. So traits like empathy and relationship building, creativity, like the ability also to imagine things that aren't there. And all of those are things that computers have yet to do better than a human. So in my particular role, as this new auto classification comes in and tries to take my job, we've identified that someone, a human, is going to need to teach the tool, train the tool, how and where to look for the aboutness of a document in order to apply the correct terms. And then someone, a human, will need to perform quality assurance on the tool to make sure that it's applying the right terms. And someone will have to continue to refine the tool, and then someone will have to maintain the documentation for all of these tasks. And that's probably just the beginning. So I never personally expected to become a taxonomist, but as we've kind of worked through the things that we'll need for this project, there's been more of a need for advanced taxonomy skills, and my organization is paying for me to get those for that training, and I'll be able to use that in this role and roles beyond. And so all of that has turned what could have been an intimidating and uncertain situation into one full of possibility. So we're going to hear about more of the amazing work that's being done with AI, and that there's one of those robots that Dr. Wacholder was describing earlier. And I look forward to hearing your thoughts and ideas about how we as a community can continue to foster this important relationship that's being and is continuing to be built between humans and machines. Thank you.
So next, it's my pleasure to introduce another of our alumni, Vidya Subramanian. And she is the manager of content information at Dow Jones, and she works with, among other things, one of my favorite indexes, which is Factiva, and she's going to talk about the role that automation plays in that and her role in this work.
Have to apologize in advance because my presentation has no robots, active or otherwise. Okay, so I think Factiva is a database that Rutgers certainly subscribes to, so everybody should be able to access it. And it is a news database like any other. We aggregate information from thousands of different publications, and it's all normalized and tagged, and it's all in one place. It was actually born of a joint venture with Reuters, of all companies, back in the mid-1990s, and then Dow Jones bought it out in early 2000s, and it's now its own entity. I've been working there almost 8 years now, which is crazy to think about. I started there as an intern from when I was in Barbara's class, and then I transitioned into full-time, and I've been there since, but I'm happy to say that every 2 years I've hopped into a different department, into a different role. So now I manage a team of specialists, and they are responsible for maintaining the database that powers the content that you might see when you search in Factiva. So I just wanted to highlight a few numbers of the scope of the database. So we have around 1.7 billion documents in our archive. We index about 1.2 million articles a day from 1,500 or so providers, and I'll talk a little bit more about what an information provider is. Just for the scope for the work that we do, so in the last year, we added about 1,700 sources or so, and we cover 190 countries in 28 languages. So we are a very robust organization. My team is very small, it's 4 people, but my department, I belong to a data strategy department, we're about 500 people, and we are anywhere from here to Shanghai, to Singapore, to Barcelona, to Tokyo, you name it, in the major cities, we are there. We talk a lot about AI, and I do worry that at times, yes, a machine could probably do the indexing work that I do. But then when I step back and I look at the life cycle of all of the work that goes into getting a particular content into a database, I'm relieved to know that that's always not the case. So I'm going to kind of walk you through what our life cycle is like And I have to say, when I wrote this slide, I had just watched A Star is Born, which was a wonderful movie. So that is where the title of my slide is from, I have to say. And this is a very, very simplified, I would say, life cycle of how we onboard a source into Factiva, like how does the mechanic work. And this is the area where we have information specialists, which is what my team is called. We have researchers, we have content curators. Some of them do have librarian backgrounds. I know at least 3 of them graduated from the Rutgers School from 90s onwards. So it's definitely a valued profession and name to have. A lot of our salespeople have library backgrounds. And because our audience is other information professionals, when you're selling a database, you need to be able to talk to other librarians who, often make the decision to purchase this for their organization. So the first step is to identify publishers. So I'd like to think of us as like the opposite of Google, right? So Google's aim is to go out there and scrape everything that they can scrape so they can say that they have everything. Our aim is to go out there and just really find what our customers and what people use the database are interested in. So they may not be as interested in like a human interest website as they might be about a website that covers an industry or a region really well, right? So we have a global licensing team, so they will go out and they will talk face-to-face with these publishers and say, here's why you should be part of our database, right? And some of these publishers, sometimes they get scared because they're like, if everyone comes to your database to get my data, they're not going to buy it from me. And, we're also a publishing company. We publish the Wall Street Journal, so we know exactly what that's like. So they, a lot of them, do end up working with us. But just because they work with us doesn't mean that, that content can be ingested into Factiva. So this is where my team and the peers of my team start to come in. So they actually have to review the format in which they produce their content, because it has to be normalized in somehow, right? So if Karen produces a newsletter, and in her newsletter she has a headline one way and we identify a headline a different way, if she has a byline is tagged one way and we tag it a different way, we need a language that talks to each other that says, okay, her headline means our version of this, right? And we have to be able to ingest that content. So we have a team that says, okay, their format is good, we can take their content into Factiva, and all of that happens. And this is where my team comes in. So we kind of onboard that provider onto our platform. We do manual source coding, because at this point we do have auto coding and auto classification, but there's no content in our database for the systems to run on. So it doesn't know what it is that we're adding. So we are the ones who are reviewing the website or reviewing the publication and saying, yes, this is a newspaper, it covers New Jersey, it's about the pharmaceutical industry, and it's published in New Brunswick, right? So we are the ones who are making that determination. And that's just a few points of indexing, but each one of our source records has over 100 metadata fields, and we manually index most of them. So at this point, we've said that we're going to onboard this content, we're going to have it, and we build our filters and we test the data. And again, this is a very involved human process. So we have developers that do build the filters, and then you need humans to make sure that what the filter interpreted as the article really comes out as the article, right? So that's very important. And this entire life cycle probably takes around 6 to 8 weeks. So it's pretty involved. It doesn't happen in just over a couple of days. And then at the end, we release it into the platform, and then it doesn't end there, right? You have to make sure that the content is coming in on time, and you have to make sure that it's also complete. So we do have, this is where we have more of our machine learning technologies. So we have systems that will say, well, the expected volume was 60 articles, but only delivered 20 articles. There may be something wrong. Or the content is coming in, but for whatever reason, it's not making it onto the platform. There's something wrong. So while a machine is doing that work, It's only flagging to you that there's an error. It's not telling you what the cause of the error is or how to resolve it. So you still need a team of specialists to look into that, right? And this cycle is continuous. It starts all over again when we onboard a new provider. And I told you we had around 1,500 providers or so. So sometimes sources stop publishing, they change ownership, they can change filters or formats completely. So they might have been providing one way. Then they said, hey, we changed our technology platform and now we produce it like this. Well, we have to go back and now we have to build our filters all over again. Like it's never ending. So this process is continuous. And at the very end, I know it's a lot of text, but I wanted to show you all the fields that we code to in the back end. So right in the very first line, you have a source code, which is like a unique identifier. In this case, J is for Wall Street Journal. And we don't have just one source name, we have 6. And that's because two fields is the alphabetical sorting. So you don't have everything show up under the, you need to know how to sort it. If this was in French, then you would have, its name equivalent in French, or if it was in Russian, you would have it in Cyrillic. So we have global teams, like humans have to do this. The machine, Google Translate or whatever natural language processing technology we have is not good enough to do the translation work that we do now. And then a lot of other just metadata that our customers are interested in. So they want to know, when does it come in every day? When is what's the oldest article of it that I can find? Do you have full text of it, right? So we do all of this like manually because the system doesn't know. It only goes off of this information that we provided. So here it tells you a brief description and its frequency. It tells you it publishes towards the bottom Monday to Saturday. And then here's a lot more of everything that we code to. And we repeat this process across around 33,000 sources. So it's a big database to maintain day in and day out. And a lot of it is, there's a lot of validation in the database, obviously, that will catch errors, but a lot of it doesn't. It's very manual. And here's some more. So here we code to, I can tell you when it says the primary source type in the middle, it tells you that it's a newspaper. And then it tells you, for example, we code this because it's a Wall Street Journal. We code it to, for example, as an investing security source. It's coded to financial services. It's coded to a newspaper that belongs to the United States. It's coded, has some internal coding. And then it also tells you the days we don't publish. And that's what tells the system to not expect any content. And then it won't yell at us to say, hey, there's stuff missing. And we say, yeah, we know it's missing. It's not supposed to be there, right? So all of this is done pretty manually. And my day-to-day is looking after this database. So we have a lot of routine maintenance tasks that we do to make sure that the information that our customers are looking for is accurate, that when they open the source categorizer and they're looking under newspapers, they find a newspaper and they don't find something else that they're not expecting to see. And we have a whole nother team, to Karen's point, because our article level indexing is mostly automated. So we have teams, of course, that teach the machines and they keep it in shape for accuracy and precision and recall and all of that stuff. But for the most part, it passes through our source processing system, and most of the tags are added pretty manually. But because we cover such a robust range of languages, you do need the language expertise to teach the systems of all the rules to look for, right? And this last page is just some references for you guys. So we do have, Dow Jones has an AI Center of Excellence. So it's a very new thing that they launched this year, and it's honestly because we are a publishing organization, we are a print organization. There's a lot of anxiety about machine learning and AI, even within my organization, because it's, I think it's a normal fear to have. regardless of what stage of your career that you're in. So it's really to get comfortable with the opportunities, like Karen said, about that AI can present to a media company, right? So I've posted a link to that blog there, and also to our job boards. We do recruit for interns, and we have a pretty big content/info team based in South Brunswick, very close to Princeton. So if anyone's interested, they can also go to the job site. Okay.
Okay. So last, it's my pleasure to introduce Robin Kaplan, and she is a PhD student in media studies at the School of Communication and Information, and she's finishing her PhD, and she's affiliated with the Media and Information Policy. She is a Media and Information Policy Scholar at the Data and Society Research Institute, which does all kinds of interesting work, and she'll tell you a little bit about that.
Okay, so now for something entirely different. Okay, so as Nina said, I'm a PhD candidate here. Oh, how do I play this? Whoops. I know how to do this.
I think for the slideshow and then present.
This says present. Oops. Sorry.
That's okay.
Oh, there we go. Okay. So I am a PhD candidate here at Rutgers. I'm hopefully finishing my PhD soon. It's been way, way too long. And part of the reason for that is about 2 years into doing my coursework, I started working for policy institutes, what most people refer to as think tanks, but they can be referred to as research institutes in the area of information and data policy. And I actually think it was a paper I did for Nina's class that got me my first job. It was on the notion of informed consent in health informatics. So I think that was the writing sample I submitted to the very first think tank that I actually ever worked for. Okay, so who am I? As I said, I'm an information and policy scholar. I have worked for think tanks for about 5-6 years. The first one I worked for was called the GovLab at NYU, and most of the work I did was on open government data and open data policy. My work there was really focused on how do governments release data, which departments are really releasing data, what is the type of information they're providing, and what purpose does this really serve? Is it for an accountability and transparency purpose, as they're claiming, or is it to facilitate something like a public-private partnership, which was one of the other purposes for these programs that were being adopted by the Obama administration and all around the world. So that was the area that I really got my start into. Then I took a job at Data and Society, where I was a researcher for 3 years, and I got to actually go into more of my media and information policy background. So I just wanted to say a little bit about what it is like working for a think tank. So when you do information policy for a research institute, you have a few different objectives. The first is to bring people with diverse backgrounds together around common concerns. So what that can mean, a lot of my job involves writing white papers about things that are going on in information policy. And what a white paper is a way to explain an issue in a way that's accessible to a lot of different people so they can come with a common basis of understanding. And then you bring different stakeholders. Stakeholder is a really annoying word, but basically somebody who has a stake in something, into areas to get them to talk about an issue. So for what I do mostly media and information policy and platform governance. So getting people from government and platforms and the media industry and civil society organizations together in rooms. You try and increase public understanding of issues through media. So a lot of my job is has been talking to journalists in the past. And it's grant funded, so it can change really rapidly. So you have to take on new issues incredibly quickly. All right, so I said this is a little bit different because I'm an I'm an information professional who often studies information professionals. I'm not worried about my job necessarily being automated. Maybe I should be, I don't know. So I'm treating these two parts of the question separately. So giving you a bit of background into what my area of information, being an information professional is, and then dealing with this issue of how is automated information organization changing the world. Okay, so my take on this question is going to go through a little bit of the research that I've done for this think tank, trying to understand this very issue. So the first way I really encountered this problem was in a grant-funded project that we got, which was called Who Controls the Public Sphere in an Era of Algorithms? It was the worst title for a grant ever. And what we were doing, this was 2015, this was before the election happened, and we were trying to understand what it means when all of these different users and organizations are coming onto these centralized information systems like Facebook and Google, and really what could go wrong. So we did a bunch of case studies around Russian disinformation practices, they were going on then, around the impact that these metrics were having on the news media industry, which I'll talk about in a little bit, on the use of these platforms to do things like kind of soft power, trying to prioritize some information in different regions versus others to influence public opinion. There were lots of different areas that we saw this as a concern. Okay. So really the question was, what happens when one or two information systems have an outsized impact on the production, distribution, and circulation of information? And one of the areas that I took this was trying to understand how the Facebook newsfeed incentivized different publishing practices at different times. So the newsfeed basically is an automated version of policy for the company, economic goals, and also kind of their own mission statements around what they want to have prioritized at any given moment. And so the way I first started studying these issues was trying to understand how changes to those policies and changes to the newsfeed led to drastic increases or drastic decreases in traffic. So I looked at how changes in the way they prioritize headlines led to increases in these publications, which we often refer to as clickbait. BuzzFeed, not really anymore. They have a very robust news organization at this point. And then how changes to the newsfeed led to drastic decreases in their traffic rates. And I looked at this as a method of understanding how platforms are kind of implementing standards. The second way I've looked at this issue is through this issue of what constitutes false news or fake news. I know everybody probably hates this term now, and how platforms are developing standards in connection with a bunch of other stakeholder groups. So I wrote this white paper called Dead Reckoning, Navigating Content Moderation After Fake News, that looked at all of the different efforts to do this, to define fake news, whether something was intentionally false information spread or unintentionally, different type-based approaches and feature-based approaches. And then I looked at how platforms were trying to implement solutions in response to those different definitions. So how were they creating partnerships with fact-checking organizations? What content standards were they implementing? What were governments doing? Just to give a broad overview of an issue. And my more recent work has been kind of diving into this issue of content standards more specifically. So this is my latest work for Data and Society. It's called Content or Context Moderation. And what it was an interview study with 10 different platforms. So Facebook, Google, Twitter, Reddit, Patreon, Vimeo, Wikimedia, Microsoft Bing, Discord, and Medium. And what I really wanted to understand was how content standards, how policymakers, the people who are deciding what is, let's say, harassment or bullying or hate speech or disinformation or spam or terrorist content, how those decisions about what content should or should not be allowed on their platform changes depending on the scale of the company. So I spoke to policy representatives from companies of various sizes to understand how policies shift depending on whether or not you're a really, really small company, so the artisanal, which is a terrible word, but it's the word that's used in the industry for some reason, which is basically, information professionals made up of lawyers and people with MLIS degrees and also anthropologists and sociologists, come up with, classify the flagged information that they get from users into their different content standards. And these could be very, very small companies. So the people who are doing these work in those companies, it can be as small as 4 people, versus the industrial companies like Facebook and Google, who have tens of thousands, and then a third version, which is referred to as community reliant, which is describing the Wikimedias or Reddits, where you can have hundreds of thousands of volunteer moderators and very few people who actually work for the company who are doing policy. And I look at how policies change depending on these models. And then lastly, how the use of automation versus humans to detect and enforce standards is unfolding in these different companies. Okay, so finally, the promise and perils of automated information organization. So how does this impact automated information organization? So what I learned through this is that automated detection technologies are increasingly being used to detect and remove or detect and review content violations. So only for certain types of content is automation being used to actually remove. And that's in content types that are easily, where you can tell there's a repeat across a system. So spam, child pornography, trademarked content, terrorist content, all content that can be hashed. That is content where you're seeing a lot of automation regardless of the size of the platform. Use by individual companies to detect things like graphic violence or hate speech or fake accounts or bullying and harassment really depends on the company. So for the smaller companies, you really don't see any of this use of automation because they often don't have the data to support it. In the larger companies, you're starting to see a lot. So, but what will happen is that it's a combination of automated detection and then review. So it's being detected and then it's going over to human reviewers who then assess the context of each. But the question that's really being asked in my field right now is what can happen when content standards are too inflexible to cultural context? So when, as Nina said at the outset, not everybody has the same definition of what fake news is, of what even hate speech is, of what bullying or harassment is. So this is a major concern in information policy right now. And we're seeing some of that through some mistakes that are happening at these industrial companies. Now, this could be happening through automated detection technologies and also through human review, but there's been several instances where there's been a failure to understand the context of information as it's been coming through systems. So this was one example where Facebook detected this as being pornographic, even though it's a piece of art. One of the other kind of major dangers that people are worried about, though, is the use of too formal or static rules to start understanding what things like hate speech are that are divorced from the local cultural context. And we're starting to see that, or we've been seeing that for a while in use by the industrial platforms. So this was a report that came out a couple of years ago that looked at how Facebook's rules protected white men from hate speech, but not black children. I think they've amended it since this point. It was an example of how when a company tries to formalize rules too broadly, they can end up losing the context of speech and they can divorce these decisions from the cultural and political contexts. Okay, so why automate though? So the promises of using automated technologies in content moderation. Content moderation can often be very traumatic for workers. It's for the companies that are doing this at a massive scale. They're often employing people in areas like the Philippines and Sri Lanka, and people are having to review thousands of pieces of content today, make decisions in 6 seconds or less. It can often be expensive and exploitative, and it can only happen after the fact. So after somebody's already flagged content, which means the damage is already done. What are the perils? So context is hard for both people and algorithms. So formalized rules for the industrial companies that often do these broad level rules and then have people implement. It's often difficult to get context, which means that content can get removed without reason. Content policies need to be localized. One of the major issues that we're seeing is that neither the small or the large companies are investing resources in the linguistic and cultural capacity to learn from user inputs in areas like Myanmar. That was one of the major areas that they were having this problem. And formal and static rules often tend to ignore important cultural conditions and power dynamics. Okay, so where do we go from here? From the policy perspective, we're trying to understand how to make these systems better. Who do we trust to make decisions about content, whether it's going to be platforms or civil society organizations or governments. Trying to understand how we can improve models for automated detection and combine it with human review in effective ways, and how can we increase transparency and oversight or even influence standards.
So I guess now we chat. Now we have the opportunity to chat among ourselves. So before I have some questions, but before I do, let me ask if any of you want to ask any of us questions.
Not a question, I guess more of a comment, because I guess we are, like Factiva is a platform, and one of the things that we try to do, and what my team does, is to flag sources that you think is a news source, but can in fact have propaganda or government-issued material in them, right? So I think of like TASS is like a really prominent Russian news agency, and it's widely known to be like the arm of the Russian government. Or People's Daily, which is a newspaper from China, and it's the newspaper for the Communist Party, right, of China. And if you are a researcher at a company and you're looking at these sources and you don't know that that's what the context of that source is. So one of the things that we do is we do research that information, and if we think a source is like, say, government-owned or controlled, or we provide the publisher data so you can then make the decision, do you think this information is valuable for your research or not?
So I'm curious about some of the details. So Karen, when you were talking about the software that they're bringing in, I don't know, they're allowed to tell us what kind of software they're looking at. Did you have a chance to evaluate how well it worked and what was involved in using it?
Yeah, sorry, my phone is on. Yeah, actually, it's interesting because we actually haven't just now selected the tool. So the process, there was like a proof of concept, and so we had to have a training data, as you mentioned, was the documents that we feed into the tool and see what it returned. We had humans tag the documents and see how the tool responded in comparison to what the humans did. And one of the interesting points that we found out of this process is that humans tag things differently too, right? So there's subjectivity there as well. And so really the reason why we still are just now, and in fact I mentioned that it's been 2 years before I came that they were trying to get this process going, is because they realized how much work goes into making the tool precise, and how many iterations happen, and how much testing, and how much failure really is part of this process. And so, we still are at the point where we now have to actually go back and refine our vocabulary. Through the failures of the tool, we discovered, well, maybe there's problems with the actual vocabulary that we're using. So maybe we need to do some refinement on the vocabulary so that the tool can have good terms to choose from. So it's a continual process in that regard.
So it actually made you, the feedback that you got in addition to having you train the system, taught you about some ways that you could make your vocabulary better and have the system perform better and ultimately do the job better.
Absolutely true. Yeah. And actually, and also, in the process, we have to talk to our stakeholders about, how they would want documents to be tagged as we inform the system. And so it also teaches me as a manual indexer, like what are the better processes? You know, so it's continual. It's actually really an affirmation of how this is sort of a hand-in-hand work. You know, that we really, that context matters, that people might have had ways that they wanted documents to be tagged at one point in time, and now, you know, now they want them differently, or now they want us to focus on higher level, or just things. So it's all, you know, there's definitely like a dance to be done between the machine and all of the people that are involved in the ultimate product.
So Vijay, my question for you is, and I also don't know how much you're free to talk about this, but the indexing part of Factiva, which is done automatically, and I assume it is done very quickly because you input so many new articles a day. I forget the number that you said.
1.2 million, yep.
A day, right? So it's got to be pretty robust and pretty fast. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that system and how it works and what kind of categories it uses.
Yeah, so we have homegrown tools and tools that they've purchased and then, you know, defined to our own taxonomy. So we have our own proprietary taxonomy that gets used across all of our platforms. So we have about 1,100 subject codes. I want to say like millions of company codes, because most of the content that comes in is typically mentioned about a company. Just as many people codes, because it identifies a person that's mentioned. And I would say almost every country, city, subnational, regional code that you can possibly think of, right? So an article will come into the system, it'll read the headline mentions Apple, right? And then in the lead paragraph, it might mention Tim Cook, it might mention Apple twice more times, and then in the body of the paragraph, it might mention Apple a couple more times. It might mention Google and Microsoft and a few other people as well. So the way the rules are written, it would say if for example, the company's mentioned the headline, it's mentioned here this amount of times, it's a pretty safe bet to say that this article is actually about the company, right? It's going to say it's an occurrence code for Microsoft because Microsoft is mentioned in the article, but it's not actually about Microsoft, right? So we have these rules in place, categorizers, rule-based auto-coding, but no system is perfect. And like Karen said, you have to introduce new taxonomies and new words into it all the time. So one of our key focus right now, you know, for example, things like cryptocurrencies, things like marijuana legalization or cybersecurity, all these terms is stuff the system doesn't know because it doesn't have enough of a sample data or training data to learn from. So you have to introduce those new concepts into the platform for it to recognize, oh, these are the new subjects that it's talking about.
This is one of the things that really interests me. So this is part of your job. It's
a team that's
new
parallel
topics
to mine.
Not your jobs personally, but like the information professionals who work at Factiva is saying, okay, here's a new concept that's important and it needs to be picked up by our index, and then you have to say train the computer program and say here are documents that are about cryptocurrency, and then watch what comes out of it and say, okay, it has a pretty good accuracy on cryptocurrency.
Yeah, and we tend to use machine learning more than AI because there's a little bit of a difference, right? Like AI is, sometimes you feel like it's acting upon the information where it's getting, whereas what we're saying is it helps us identify patterns, right? So it's identifying patterns that these 100 documents. So you say these 100 documents are about cryptocurrency, like Karen said, and then you feed it to the system and you think, okay, will it pick up all of these 100 articles as cryptocurrency articles? And if something is wrong, well, you have to go back and you have to tweak the rule because it's very often your rule that's not precise enough for that system to tag that content. So, yeah. And you have to do it across like almost 30 languages, so you need the people.
So you need people who know, so languages are an advantage.
Yeah.
Okay. And so Robin, in terms of you talked a little bit about it, but in terms of you were talking about things like pornography. It's not too hard to identify, but there were a couple. I forget which other categories you mentioned, but there were a couple that surprised me a little bit when you said that you could do them pretty reliably.
So there's a difference between what a company would be willing to do versus what they can do reliably. And that really depends on the motivations of the company. So pornography is actually not that easy for some companies. Vimeo is an interesting example because they like to think of themselves as a more artistic platform. And so they do allow pornography in artistic contexts. So for them, that's something that they will never automate because it requires too much context for them to understand whether or not something is pornographic or whether or not it's being used within art. For terrorist content, that's another area that in the interviews, people expressed a significant amount of concern about the reliability of automated technologies to be able to detect and remove that kind of content. And what we heard from a few different platforms was that the likelihood of false positives in those databases is actually incredibly high. But that when you're talking about content standards and the use of automation, it's not just issues of reliability that are informing these decisions, but sometimes it can be politics. So would it be more politically dangerous for them, U.S. companies, to leave something up or pull something down? So often they err on the side of pulling down. So there's lots of different ways that there are some very tough decisions being made about when they're going to be using automated technologies for this kind of work.
Right, and it also reflects the fact, like, what's pornography to different companies.
Exactly.
This is pornography into another company.
It's not. And so it can also, it depends a lot on what the user base is. So Facebook tends to be much more conservative because they used to have 13-year-olds on the site. I don't think anybody young actually uses Facebook anymore. But they might be more conservative in their determinations of what pornography is.
So another question that I have is, given your training and your education at Sky, what do you think what advice would you give to our students who are here, our students who are out there, about preparing themselves for going out into the real working world, the world as you know it? So Karen?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things is to be really proactive about finding opportunities to learn, be really open to learning. I think we all have kind of had ideas of what we would do when we were in school. And then when you get out there, there's a lot more opportunity. Maybe people can get fixated on looking for the thing that they thought, but there's really a lot of opportunity if people are willing to kind of push themselves, to be creative, to think about things that you're interested in and be willing to propose them and self-market and things like that. And so I think that, we're obviously, the landscape changes really fast. Technology is making it so that things are changing, much faster than they did. But I think it can be exciting if people are willing to, just kind of trust themselves, trust their own abilities to gain new skills and work with their colleagues and work with bosses and things like that to find opportunities for themselves.
Yeah. To that, I would add, certainly to be as broad as possible. I was an education major undergrad. I thought I was going to teach history. I did, and then I realized it wasn't for me. I came into grad school thinking I would become a school librarian because that was the next step that would keep me closest to being in a school, and then that's clearly not where I am today. So it was really being open to the broadest range of possibility. And a lot of my worry in the beginning was, I don't know. I'm not a journalist. What am I doing at a publishing company? I'm not a coder, right? And it's, I think it was Nina or Connie who said it earlier, is you have to be data literate. You don't have to know how to code in Python or R or whatever language that you were mentioning earlier, but you have to know those technological concepts to know how you fit in, right? So a lot of the database is maintained using technology, but then where my part comes in is to make sure that we're keeping our publishers happy, right? We're making sure that we're implementing their contracts and their rights the way they wanted to, and that's entirely like a human person job. You have to know, like in Karen's presentation, you have to know how to collaborate with other people. You have to know how to have those people skills, and computer is not going to have that anytime soon. So.
And do you have any thoughts about how we could better train our students? I know you're not an MI.
I'm not an MI,
but in terms of students coming out with tech, to be information professionals with technological skill and technological knowledge from the companies that you've worked for and the employees that you've met, what do you think is helpful to people?
I'd say knowing technology is good, but don't underestimate all of the humanities training that you get exposed to, either in your undergrad or in your master's. A lot of what these companies are needing, in the area that I've been studying in content moderation, a lot of what these companies are looking for are people with kind of those humanities-based backgrounds who can also kind of operate like an information professional. So having both experiences is very good. Most of the people that we spoke with, the people who are working in kind of content moderation policy and enforcement positions within the U.S., outside of the U.S., it's an incredibly different context, are coming from backgrounds like library science, but also anthropology, sociology, history, philosophy. So making sure that you're combining both sides of yourself, if you have them.
Okay.
I wanted to add one more thing about the soft skills and the importance of that. And I mean, it really does become like a really great marketing package if you can have either tech experience or tech comfort, or comfort with technologies, but also know how to or feel comfortable interacting with people. And I mean, it really is invaluable. I was a psychology undergrad, and it's really come in handy, like as much as anything. Probably maybe the most valuable thing. And so I would just say, don't, as Robin said, don't underestimate those skills for sure.
I was a psych undergrad too.
There's a pattern there. Okay, so now let's see if we have some questions from students who are virtually here.
Well, I'm going to be the voice of the online student, and this is a question from Daniel. So Daniel says he's really interested in AI and machine learning, but he has little exposure to what is happening in the industries. So what types of data science and machine learning methods are being used? Maybe types of clustering, neural networks. He's just looking kind of for a general overview of what skills are being thrown around and what would be really helpful. So kind of a little bit about what you guys were talking about.
Well, basically, it's taking care of and managing information and data, storing, saving it, learning patterns from it. That's a really big thing. Taking archive data or newspaper data that's coming out every day, and there's too much there for people to read. And so we need people who can write computer programs that pull out patterns that people might have been able to make if they could read that much information, but it requires some that combination of being able to use technology and the sort of humanities knowledge and critical thinking, and then come into visualizing that information. Then another big area is metadata and linked metadata, interface design, which is one of our specializations. And I'm not giving really a fully adequate answer to that question because there's more.
Does anybody else have anything to add? No? Other questions? Go ahead.
I had a question about some of your research. Nothing to do with AI, but in a way. But I'm just curious what the platforms that you studied, that you examined. Like, I think of Facebook and Wikipedia as being very different. So in terms of how you studied how they manage the content, in terms of automation or whatever, did you take that into account when you were sort of?
So that was the goal of the whole. So we were trying to understand. Can you repeat the question a little bit, Robin? Oh, so the question was, the audience member views the platforms that I studied as being very different. So did I take that into account? So one of the major issues in my area of platform governance is that it is actually incredibly difficult to do comparative platform policy because of that very reason. A lot of these companies have a hold in their area of marketplace, or their business model may shift in such a way that it still makes it really difficult. So Vimeo and YouTube are both video hosting platforms, but one is a subscription base and one is more advertiser driven plus a subscription base plus a million other things that they're doing right now. So it does make it difficult to compare. What we were looking at primarily was platforms that use content moderation in one way. How could we draw out differences within how they create policy? So it's looking primarily at their kind of trust and safety divisions and how they might differ. So we were looking for areas that were connected with the news media industry in some way, because as with a lot of projects like this, it started with a different research question than it ended up having when we wrote it up quickly. And then, so that's why something like Patreon was there as well. That's a crowdfunding platform, but it mostly services amateurs and media professionals that are looking to fund their work. So we were trying to understand how those platforms were addressing this issue of disinformation in their content policies. And then the goal was to actually draw out those differences. So we do think Wikimedia is an entirely different platform than Facebook and Google. We classified them as what we were referring to as community reliant. And then we tried to describe the dynamics between this kind of smaller policy team that's located within the company and then their relationships with their volunteer moderators. And then that's entirely different from this industrial model that was described to us in the major companies, which is entirely different from these smaller companies. And then the goal is to provide this information to policymakers that are really looking to get at the industrial, but the decisions that they're making are going to have an impact for Wikimedia and Reddit, which is a different model, and then the smaller companies as well.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I had a question about how your humanities backgrounds and critical thinking skills, and this is a question for everybody, come into play in your job in this divided partisan landscape. But I'm also thinking about recent decisions by, say, Twitter to get rid of the bot accounts, but also to finally identify something as hate speech and shut it down. But it took a while. So I'm just interested in no particular order, but in hearing how you use your psychology background, your critical thinking skills, even your knowledge of history, your research in media, to navigate such a difficult partisan time when one person's fake news is another person's gospel.
Yeah, a big part of my job, we call ourselves the librarians of Factiva because while we have all this content, a lot of our, like, even internal folks, like salespeople, when they try to sell this to other people, they don't know what it is that they're selling a lot of the time, and they don't know sometimes how to position it, or what you would say, is you can talk about the bells and whistles, but at the end of the day, they care about what's in it. You say you have all this content, but what does that mean? So we are a reference desk of sorts, so people come to us with questions and we have to figure out, is that what you really want, or does your client actually want this, right? And that's a lot of just practice, because sometimes we answer the same question in different variations over and over again from different people because we're a huge organization. And also a lot of your critical thinking background, so you would have to assess who the client is, figure out, okay, would they really be interested in something like this, or would they want this alternative solution? So I don't have to be knowledgeable of the industry that they're in, right? So they might be a customer of the banking industry, or they might be a government institution. I don't have to know that much about that industry. I just have to know what's in my database. to help them answer that question. Does that make sense? Okay.
Yeah, I think another thing actually made me think about was, the user focus of our work, right? And so it's easy to kind of get bogged down in sort of the tech communication and the topics and things like that. But I mean, as we're reevaluating our tools and reevaluating our vocabulary and having to talk to people, one of the things we have to keep coming back to is what are the needs? Are the needs being met? And in order to do that, we have to get people to open up to us, right? That sounds very soft, but we have a lot of stakeholders that are really committed to how they think our work should be done, right? And so in order for us to get them to move and for us to work collaboratively, we have to make sure that they know that we're working for them, right? And so sometimes that has to do with, how you talk to people, whether or not you communicate your own ethics and your own values and things like that, and so that people will know that, so they know that they don't need to dig in on principle, that they're actually, we're all sort of working towards the same goal. And so that's one of the things that's sort of an intangible that you don't think about is going to be valuable, but if you know how to listen to people, and if you know how to draw people out or get people to communicate what their actual needs are, in the end, that's going to serve what your product need is at the end of the day.
For me, I mean, I'd say I'm mostly humanities, so it's a different question. I think that for me in my work, what best serves me is trying to do this kind of suspension of disbelief and use of theories that I have learned around how people trust information to be a bit more sympathetic to the other side of people who are kind of caught in a different information system than we may be. And then, so I was saying to Nina actually that it's actually the combination of this media studies, which is what I'm getting my PhD, in, and then the having information science minor in the PhD program at Rutgers that actually made what I do a lot easier, because I can take these theories from the humanities area and take a history of media and know a bit more about how we've defined things like objectivity as different in the past, different moments where there was also partisan media to place what's going on right now in perspective, but then understand that within the context of the information systems and how information professionals may define something or categorize content.
Robin, you used a really interesting phrase. You talked about people being caught in an information system. Right. And I wondered if you could explore a little bit more what you meant by that in some kind of comparative way.
Okay. So how do I get into this without scaring everybody? Okay. So at Data and Society, there is an entire initiative that I worked on early on, but then moved away to go back on my work in policy because it's incredibly hard to stomach, is media manipulation and disinformation online. So I was looking at a lot of different forums and spaces where people were coming together and doing things like saying very kind of racist or sexist or misogynist things, and really much operating in different spaces. So that's one way to understand that, that the internet facilitates a lot of different interactions with information, and sometimes that can be facilitated through algorithmic systems. So Facebook can start learning your likes and dislikes and start giving you content that can make your feed look very different, and the likes and dislikes of your friends and family look very different than somebody who's living even in Pennsylvania or in America. And then in other cases, you can seek out communities as well that can be very insular online, where your beliefs are constantly reinforced through other people who share the same beliefs as you. And then you can actually even take that and go to an information system like Google and get it further reinforce. So there was a paper that came out of Data and Society by somebody named Francesca Tripodi, who looked at conservative circles in, I think, outside of Virginia, and looked at how terms that were said on something like Fox News could then be taken to Google, and basically you'll get a return of results that would look entirely different from what you and I might get because we would be primed to use a different term. So there's lots of different ways that the internet can kind of facilitate these insular feedback loops of information.
Right, and because a lot of search systems are, search engines like Google, right, they're trained on your data and they know what terms you've looked for.
Right.
And they really want to use Facebook and stuff like that to bring back the results that your friends like. And right, and it's gets talked about a lot. Creating these insular worlds where, you know, whatever the point of view is of your friends is the document, is going to be reflected in the documents.
Exactly, yeah.
That
So
you see.
referred to as the filter bubble or echo chamber.
Right.
Okay, so we're about ready to wrap up, but I'm going to challenge each one of the panelists, including you, Nina, for just really a couple of one-word kinds of answers for each of you, and then each of you can give a little bit of a closing remark to that, and then we're going to be joined by Barbara Burton to wrap this up. So here's the challenge. So in one or two words, what is the biggest promise? What is the scariest peril of automated information organization or AI for each one of you? So I know, pretty scary.
One word.
Cheers.
I knew it was going to be a problem that I sat at the first.
I know. So
the promise in one or two words. Is possibility enough of a word? I mean, the potential. The possibilities are endless. Okay. And the peril is that the possibilities are endless. And so the balance of that, right? And so my closing remarks, actually, I was thinking a lot about Robin's work and thinking that, you know, I think one of the most important things is to stay informed, right? So we've been exposed to a lot of, you know, we have a big network of scholars who are really digging in, and but the key is to go out and find out, and then advocate to other people, and it's sort of our responsibility to be the you know, to talk to our communities about what's happening and be advocates. So.
That's hard to follow up to. I know, that was a great answer. I would say the promise is access in terms of like the democratization of information. Like you know, as a librarian, you're a firm believer that everybody should have the access to information that they need, you know, to be lifelong learners. And I guess the peril is really in line with what Robin's work is because people have all of this access now, is to really, you know, we don't have enough people who are trained like us in information literacy to not click on the first thing that comes up in Google, to be more suspicious of stuff that people send to you, stuff that you read, and you have to sit back and say, really, does that really make sense in the context of everything else that you know in your worldview? Like, is that really the case? So the peril is that we don't have enough people who look at information critically, I would say, despite having all this access.
Okay. I would say in my work that the promise, like speaking specifically about the policy work that I talked about in the use of automation and content moderation, the promise is that automation can do a lot to help people feel safe online. So we talk a lot about speech issues with content moderation, and the general perspective is, oh, be really scared of these private companies censoring you and taking away your speech rights. But the other side of that is when people are allowed to kind of spew hate speech and misogyny and harass people and bully, that can really lead to a lot of people leaving these spaces, these public spaces. So I think the promise of automation and content moderation is being able to make some spaces a bit safer. But the Peril is the loss of context, that there is a lot of politics into how those decisions are made, and I'm always wary of rules being made in service of the minorities that are often impacted by that kind of speech. So the loss of context and power dynamics analysis. And are we giving our closing statements right now?
You can if you'd like, or Mina, why don't you go with
Okay,
your
let me
promises and
say.
perils, and we'll come back to Vidya.
The promise is from as Vidya said, from an intellectual and professional point of view, right? Our goal professionally is to help people access the information that they need and they want, and ideally we would like them to get exposed to different points of view, but not to fake news. The promise is that in theory, and this is back to the big dream of AI, that we would have systems that would do this so well that unfortunately we information professionals would need to say, well, there's not room for us here anymore. So that's the promise, and of course also a peril. But in addition, there are other perils, and one of the perils is that we trust too much in the algorithms or in the companies that hire the people that write the algorithms, and that the algorithms include represent values that are problematic, and that people, especially employers and companies, are too likely to think that, well, we have this fancy information system and it does all this work, and really we don't need to put people, as long as the systems are less than perfect, which I basically expect them to be for as long as I can foresee, that they would fail to understand that they need the human in the loop to do the kinds of things that these people are using, because it's too easy just to say, okay, we have a computer program, we don't need any people. And I think some people will say that.
So Vidya, would you like to give a closing statement real quick?
I guess my closing statement would be more pragmatic in terms of folks who are looking for jobs or, identifying is like, don't limit your scope to just being a librarian. I think you can be a librarian without even calling yourself one, right? You can be an information specialist, you can be a content curator, you can, work for platforms that Robin talked about. So there's a lot more possibilities out there than what you think.
My closing statements is that the work that Vidya and Karen do is incredibly important, and we need more human indexers. So if that's something you're inclined to do, please do it. That there's a lot more to be learned about.
Yeah.
So Karen,
I think I already gave one, but I will say one more thing is, I agree that information professionals are super important in every space, right? And so there are places that don't have anyone called a librarian or anyone called anything like an information professional. So go in and be that person, like convince a company that they need you because they need you. And that's what I would say. That we're really, really important. All of us.
I would say that information professionals are generalists. You have to work with lots of different kinds of people. You have to understand about technology. You have to understand about documents. And being an information professional involves building those skills, and especially in this changing world, preparing yourself to have the professional and intellectual flexibility to go along with the changes and to adjust, so that while you're in the MI program, this is an opportunity for you to look at these various aspects of the job, or different kinds of jobs, so that you can broadly prepare yourself for going out in the world, whereas we have said here that indexing, organizing information, making judgments about quality of content, of index terms, of taxonomies continues to be really, really important.
Okay, so I get to make the closing remarks. Ross Todd usually does this, but he's not able to be with us tonight. So it gave me the challenge of listening to you each and thinking, what am I going to remember from this when I think back? And Karen, I think one thing I'll remember is your graphic with all those people, those human indexers, and now there's just one, and it's you. So what happened to all those other people? And the point is, they're gone. They're not doing that job anymore. So there's no point of being sentimental or saying, wow, those were the days when we had all those indexers, because those days are over. But obviously you've gone on to much more interesting things. And I also just, in your closing statement, think it's interesting because I'm a graduate of the MLIS program as it was. I never was a librarian ever. I worked at Dow Jones for most of my career. But if someone asked me what is my identity, it would be, well, I'm a librarian, even though I didn't do library work. So there's a professional identity that stays with us because we love information, care about it, and that obviously comes through. But those people really are gone anyway. But they're doing other things. One of the things about thinking that you said that was so interesting, talking about what a government source is and what that means and the importance and the context there. Because we hear government documents, and if you don't automatically fall asleep and think, wow, that sounds boring, you think government documents are really trustworthy. We've got the Census Bureau, we've got all these bureaus that produce all this data. That's going to be good stuff in the United States of America in 2018. Other countries, that's not the case. And you may argue with me on that point as well for this country, but I think generally the takeaway from that is the context is so important. What does government source mean? It depends where you are.
Yeah.
And Robin, what you're doing, you could have been one of those people that disappeared because you're doing work that didn't even exist, of course. Information policy. Wow. I mean, that's pretty interesting stuff and very important because that's where we're going to be ahead of the robots, hopefully, with people that are able to understand the different pieces of the puzzle. So if we're going to stay in control of our situation, which I firmly believe we will, we're going to need people to understand what are we doing. I mean, what is actually happening, and that's where this strategy and the policy is so important. And Nina, I'm going to go home thinking about that big robot, the AI that's eating us. But I would leave you with the final. Has anyone read Steven Pinker and Steven Pinker's books? He's got this new one, Enlightenment Now, and all of this. So the problems that we are facing are obviously to a large extent now of our own making, being too afraid of robots and all of that. We're not having to chase down a pack of wolves to feed our children. We are not on the verge of starving. We are not, in most cases, we are not facing so many problems that people over the centuries have faced that I think we have to just realize life comes with some insecurity, anxiety, fear, whatever you might feel in any context, in any time. And these are problems that, as librarians, we can conquer.
All right, well, thank you, everybody. That's a wrap. This is our last colloquium for the fall 2018 semester. My gosh, it's gone by really fast. But join me again in thanking Nina Wacholder, Dr. Nina Wacholder, Robin Kaplan, Vidya Subramanian, and Karen Carter. We really thank you, everybody. We'll be back next February. We're already planning our colloquiums for next spring. Online students and colloquium students, you know what you guys have to do. It's time for your reflections. And again, thank